Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios' Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or a question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Wow, that was random. Exceptional Radio.
Hey, it's the 10th of September. Got a short phone interview that I took earlier this week that I want to share. It's about phone banking in Delaware.
And we're rolling.
Good. There's no compressor or anything on my side. It's just the raw mic input.
Oh, it's okay. Everything gets compressed on my end.
Cool.
So, it's 2020, and the 2020 election is upon us, and you've been phone banking for some time now. What exactly does that entail?
So the Jess campaign started up last fall.
Who?
Jess Garain. She's running for U.S. Senate in Delaware. She's challenging the current incumbent Chris Coons. He leans on the conservative side of the Democratic Party. He votes with Trump approximately 30% of the time, whereas someone like Pelosi is at 17 or 18%. And then Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are around 13 or 14%. He's voted to confirm over 120 Trump judges for lifetime appointment. Nielsen. He accepts more pharmaceutical money than any Democratic senator. He is like the face of neoliberal corporatism in Senate form. So that's why we're fighting him. And Jessica Rain is a typical progressive candidate along the lines of Bernie Sanders and all that. So that's where we stand. No corporate PAC donations, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, $15 an hour minimum wage with further increases tied to inflation, tuition-free preschool through college, and a whole lot more. We're fighting for all those policies.
Okay, so I take that's the gist of what you do when you're on the phone bank action.
Yeah, I try to make it all that information more conversational as opposed to a big summary. But that's what I do. I get on an auto dialer, and then it connects me with a Democratic Delaware voter, and then I introduce myself. I always use James as my name because people don't understand Yejun, and I feel like people hang up more on foreign-sounding names. I think there's this latent racist bias there.
I'm pretty sure that's a very real thing. I remember reading an article not too long ago about why people from other countries take Western names, and it's to get through the HR Byzantine conduit system.
Yeah, yep. It's very real then. And I have a very white-sounding voice. I don't know if that helps me within progressive Democrats or it doesn't matter, but I'd like to think it doesn't matter. But yeah, I call people, or the auto dialer calls people, and then we try to make people aware of the campaign, because the overwhelming majority of people who will talk to us end up supporting Jess, because the contrast between the two candidates is so strong, and the policies are very popular. Even though the DNC did not adopt Medicare for all or the legalization of marijuana, even though those are overwhelmingly popular among Democrats, when you present them in a Senate candidate form, they always pick Jess, except maybe 10 to 15% of the time.
And she is moving forward. She's won her primary and is moving on to the...
No, not yet.
That hasn't happened yet?
Yeah.
When is the Delaware primary?
Right now is a crucial get out the vote time. So the Delaware primary election is on September 15th.
Well, that's not very far away.
Yeah. Ever since like the end of August, I had committed to phone banking. Like beforehand, I was just doing it like maybe once or twice during the weekdays, and then on Sunday evenings, or maybe Saturday. It just depended. But ever since Get Out the Vote time hit, so once like 40,000 people got mail-in ballots, since that point in time, I've been phone banking pretty much every spare hour I have. So weekdays, it's like after I get off of work, 5:30 to 6-ish, to until like 8 to 8:30-ish. Every weekday except for Wednesdays, I'll hit, and I try to make time for an extra hour. And then on Saturdays and Sundays, it's been from all day, all day phone banking.
So this isn't a one-man team thing. This is like a group of people working.
Yeah.
So it's like it's a call center, but it's you do this from home, I presume.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So
we've got a big team of volunteers and some staff members too.
And there's a lot of, you guys are making positive headway though, it seems. Like you'd be pretty surprised if the campaign didn't turn out for her.
I don't expect a win. It's hard to say. He has dumped there was a campaign back in 2018. This woman named Carrie Evelyn Harris primaried a U.S. Senator Tom Carper in our state. It was a similar situation, but comparing that campaign to what we have now is like enormous. We hit like all our metrics. We blew past them way before. Like we accomplished more in our campaign at a very early time point compared with her campaign back then over the whole run of the course. So I think with Delaware, if you list yourself as a primary challenger and don't campaign at all, you get approximately 12% of the vote. If you list yourself and your candidate is, I don't know, you don't really need a candidate if you just have the policies up there. You're guaranteed approximately a floor of 30%-ish. But if you have a very strong candidate and a team, like of volunteers, we have like a very big team of, it's just hundreds of people making literally tens of thousands of dials. Per day. I think we have we have a chance to win. It all comes down to voter contact and whether we'll hit that win number. So the win number for this state is less than 60,000, which is extraordinarily low for a Senate race, and that's another reason why we're doing this. I feel like all Democratic states that have, all blue states should have very progressive-leaning senators, and because, or at least small ones, you know. It's very difficult to win a statewide election like that in more populated big states, but someplace like Delaware, yeah, it can be done.
So I'm curious about from outside of Delaware. I every so often I read about some strange corporate law that exists in Delaware that makes it really attractive for businesses to register. And I was hoping you might be able to shed some light on that.
Yeah, this is something that I've only learned relatively recently once I got involved here. So Delaware has very corporate-friendly laws that I kind of knew about them casually. I kind of knew about it through Fight Club, which was based in Wilmington. But Wilmington has or Delaware has very, let's say, credit-friendly usury laws. They can charge a much higher interest rate than they could get away with in any other state. There's tax laws that are super attractive to corporations. They don't have to pay nearly as much to be incorporated here. And on top of that, I think actually this is a bigger draw than most people might think, but we have a court of chancery that is completely dedicated to corporate law cases. And so when corporations take on law, they have law cases, they want to run it through as quickly as they can because time is money when it comes to business. And Delaware is really good about that. So that's very, very attractive for corporations. And there's a whole host of issues where Delaware is, that whole host of reasons why Delaware is so attractive to corporations. And so many are incorporated here. And so that affects the entire country because these are huge corporations, arguably the world, because they are also multinational and like there's banks. I mean, it is the source of capital, corporate capital in a lot of ways. So our state laws govern these corporate tax laws that are affecting the entire nation, and it's kind of weird. They're local laws, they're local offices. So my hope here is that we elect progressive and good candidates who are not backed by corporations to these state offices, and then we can leverage that against corporate power. I think someone like winning, like Jess, would go a huge way because that's a Senate office, so like that's a lot of power in itself. But if we can get Jess to win, it will be that much easier to get a second Jess to win for that second Senate seat. And with 1 to 2 senators in Senate for Delaware, they will have a very large platform to speak from, and they can help those down ballot progressive candidates a lot. I think it would have a huge impact on not just Delaware, but like the rest of the country. So that's my hope. Who knows? There is also there's always like doubts about how effective electoralism could be, or the limitations of it, or whether we will see change soon enough. I think like the need for like real change towards the people is it's a very urgent matter right now. But what's the alternative? You know, I'm not organizing in a bunker with other like revolutionaries. I'm just a dad working a corporate gig, so the best I can do is to like do this, and that's as much as I can hope for.
Well, I think it's fair to say that that's more than what most people actually do with their time. I read a lot of complaints on the internet and various forums about, you know, our presidential candidates and senators, and I just don't get the sensation that the people that are issuing these kinds of complaints, the loudest hecklers, are involved in this kind of this level of outreach that you're involved in.
Yeah.
I think.
Go ahead.
I think that it's actually quite impressive because you told me more in the last, 12 minutes, 13 minutes than I think I've absorbed about Delaware just from the media over the course of the last several months. I mean, I know that there's some strange corporate law, but you framed it quite succinctly. Joe Biden, our Democratic presidential candidate, he used to be a senator for Delaware.
That's correct. And this, Jess, is running for his old seat.
Oh.
Yeah, there's some irony there. So Delaware has a specific way of doing politics. It's called the Delaware Way. If you Google it, it'll pop right up. But it basically involves getting cozy with corporations and believing that it's basically trickle-down economics, where you believe that what's best for the corporations is best for the people, and you work with that. And I don't believe that to be the case. I'm not a Reaganite. And so when I kind of woke up to this relatively late. I mean, I'd always believed, like, oh, we should have universal health care, but, like, I never did anything about it. But I woke up to, like, what the neoliberal establishment was a few years back. And then I realized I was at a central location of, or what do you call it? Like a base of neoliberal policy and capitalism, or politics.
You're in the heartland of neoliberal policy.
It's weird because it's so much of corporate America is tied to Delaware through the politicians Joe Biden, Tom Carper, Chris Coons, of course, and our current Governor Carney. And this is how they rule the Senate and aspiringly the presidency and, like, our state, our governorship. So this is what politics is in Delaware. It's very, like, you have to be cozy with the right people and can't break against that, or else you don't have a political career as a Democrat. And so this is very much like an insurgent campaign against that way of doing politics. Sorry, I have a hair on my tongue. And
it's okay.
Yeah, that's what this is about. I hope it tracks and takes.
So you've got some pretty large companies. I mean, some really large companies like DuPont it has a home in Delaware.
Yeah.
And not just that, but a manufacturing center in Delaware.
Yep. That's true. And I'm not sure. So within that frame, I'd like to point out that our Senator Chris Coons, who we are challenging, his stepfather is part of the Gore family, and that is of Gore-Tex. Chris Coons is worth millions of dollars, and, like, his family is, like, probably the wealthiest family in Delaware. So we're very much I feel like we're very much fighting old money at the same time of just this corporate way of doing things. There is DuPont, that's correct, and there's all sorts of pollution issues that have occurred because of larger corporations and the corporate-friendly laws that they get. So one instance with our friendly Senator Chris Coons, he receives a lot of money from this chicken farm corporation, Mount Air, and the National Chicken Council, and the lawyers that serve Mount Air to bust unions. So he receives money from all this, and he has worked on legislation and passed it in order to allow Mount Air to be exempt from reporting emissions. And this is a company that has effectively poisoned the water with their industrial runoff in
That's no good.
lower Delaware, around, I think, Millsboro. You can't drink the water there, and you have to buy bottled water.
Oh, it's a fully realized bottled water culture.
Yeah. Down there, you can't drink the water because it's poison.
Oh, it doesn't just make you sick, it actually poisons you.
It's bad for, like, if you look up, I think, I forget the name of it. If you listen, or if you search for Mount Air and water and poison, it'll pop up.
Okay, okay.
Another thing is that the National Chicken Council has worked hard to allow relaxer regulations on
The Chicken
on
Council.
the chickens. Yeah.
God, what a terrible name for any kind of...
Chicken Council.
The National Chicken Council?
Yeah. So they've worked hard to, deregulate the chicken industry, and so that they can sell you chickens that are diseased. So they it's not.
They wouldn't admit that, of course. They wouldn't come out and say, "Yeah, we're trying to sell diseased chickens." But the kind of policies that they are behind or supporting would enable them to sell lower quality of chicken.
Right, and so another issue with these chicken farms, it was very widely reported that they weren't receiving the workers weren't receiving proper PPE, and when the outbreak started, and a lot of people were getting sick, suffering health issues. Later, there were union issues. I think people were, I don't know if they were demonstrating or actually striking, but the union workers were starting to take action. And Mount Air paid a bunch of lawyers to bust them up. And it's just horrible. Like, there is no concern for the workers of these chicken farms or the people who live around the chicken farms.
Yeah.
All the money it's just about the money, of course.
Well, isn't that usually the case? We find out that some industry has been deregulated and a whole bunch of horrible shit happens. And then the next thing you know, after the golden parachutes, it's revealed, of course, that it was just about making money.
Yeah, that's like the only outcome even possible.
A few people make some money and everyone else suffers.
Yeah, I think.
Thanks a lot, Chicken Council.
Effectively, Chris Coons is pro eating disease and drinking poison. Like if you remove some of those. If you look at it from the bigger picture.
Yeah.
He is for eating disease and drinking poison.
So there you have it. Yejun will be joining us here after the Delaware primary is over, and kind of to follow up on the things that we just talked about. It makes me really kind of wary of a situation that we're in. We've got this late stage capitalism is kind of failing all around, and lo and behold, all these laws and regulations come from one state, and it sets I feel like that's setting things up for failure. I mean, clearly it set a few people up for success, but I just feel like that it's not quite as democratized a situation as people want it to be. It just can't be.
Pretty shocking. I didn't even know Delaware was like that. Like, wow.
Yeah, it's yeah, I mean it's one of the original colonies. It's got there's a lot of there are a lot of old rules that come into effect with that place. Old standards.
It also demonstrates the seats of power for various industrial sectors that exist within the country,
Yeah.
and how the stewards or the gatekeepers of those seats tend to be those with inherited wealth or the older money or the more well-established families with the industrial connection that will perpetuate the system that accumulates resources towards the top of the proverbial pyramid.
Well, honestly, I was just thinking of the dynamic of Delaware being a colony with the, what was that British shipping company?
The East India Tea Trading Company or whatever.
Trading company.
East
Thank
India
you.
Trading Company.
Like even before the industrial era, it was all about, I mean, the British Empire, and I'm even reluctant to call it the British Empire because it was predominantly the English Empire at that point, because the Scots were constantly fighting with the English. Laws were tailored. There were letters of marque from the monarchy to, I think the most famous example, if you go way farther back to Drake, here, go mess with the Spanish and their interests. If you're caught, we'll disavow you, but you still have a letter of marque, so to speak. You can be basically what predates the pirate era, which were called privateers. Like, colonial interests are always protected.
It was 1707 when the Treaty of Union was ratified, and the Kingdom of Great Britain became the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
So.
And there was much dragging of heels and fighting by the Scots. They didn't go willingly.
Have the Scots ever gone willingly with what the British wanted? Like in the history of the Isles?
Which kind of leads me back. We were discussing hearing that phone call, like unrestrained super capitalism. And we were just talking about Dune earlier. And I was thinking of the Guild of Choam that is a big prominent thing in the Dune novels, of how money and trade and neoliberalism seems to govern the body politic.
And in that context, how neoliberalism presents itself as a savior, but ultimately leads to the same. It's not the same kind of fascism, but it's like a plutocratic fascism that then appears to be more democratic because it's not a single entity and it's a small group. So there's this semblance of appearing more democratic in neoliberalism when it's actually just more plutocratic.
I had a long time ago lost a friend. We had an argument over the concept. Oh, I wouldn't say concept, the nomenclature of neoliberalism. And he was like, well, no, we should be allowed to force people to trade with us. And I'm like, dude, that is insane. If a culture or a nation state doesn't want to deal with you on an economic level, you have no right to militarily or aggressively, or even diplomatically, whatever method you choose as the rival nation state, to force them to trade with you.
Yeah, and it's the same sentiment that when the liberals were calling for the formation of Kurdistan, I think that is the peak example of neoliberalism resulting in fascism that is unintended, but ultimately is fascism.
You know, Marianne Williams, whatever that new age kooky former candidate, whatever her name actually is, she was saying something how neoliberalism and fascism aren't the same, but I think she made a mistake. I think that she misunderstands that neoliberalism can lead to, you know, neo-feudalism, but it also can lead to fascism. And to say that that they're not the same, it's dangerous because it kind of completely ignores that they all deal in imperialism.
Yep. And I think that's an important aspect of assessing it honestly when you're trying, like, this is where people who look at American politics have come to the conclusion that there's no real left in the American system. And that's kind of where even the self-proclaimed left in America has some feudal and straight fascist viewpoints at certain like junctures.
Well, absolutely. Those who don't study history, even from a white European model of feudalism, if I were, say, German in a German kingdom and I were a farmer, I was farming on the graciousness of the landowner, right? Like, and it's not a stretch. In today's modern era, we're born in this country. If we're not from wealth, we don't own property. And like the idea that, like, and even I've struggled with this even as a child. The idea that you're born somewhere and the idea that, like, I have to pay somebody else to live somewhere. You know, I mean, when you move into economics and you're more educated over time, it makes sense on a cognitive level, but on an emotional, sort of anthropological, sociological level, you're like, how did we get to this model that the land is separated from the people, and that if you're born somewhere, you automatically, in a sense, owe a poll tax, right, to somebody who is lucky enough for 3 generations to own land enough to buy several hundred acres or several city blocks of apartment buildings. That is kind of a neo-feudal system. And
it is neo-feudalism. It absolutely is neo-feudalism. We've gotten to this really dangerous place where people confuse living in a capitalist society with being capitalists, but they're not generating capital for themselves. Most people don't even. Most people at this stage are not, you know, in a position to start buying houses. At least not millennials. Let's see, what's that number? It's low. Oh, this is the wrong website. Yeah, it's like 8 percentage points lower than it was for Gen Xers. Most millennials don't own homes at this point. Like, still, you know, I'm pushing 40. I own my home. I'm one of the few that does at this point, from my understanding. It's not a pretty picture. And then to you know, move further into this nasty, I don't even know what to call it, economic trap. Housing prices are constantly going up. Century 21 just filed for bankruptcy, which means the housing market's not doing that great. I mean, if a freaking realtors going under, that means the housing market's collapsing, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. So it could be too many property management companies, too many people who just keep holding on to homes so they can rent them out and just wring as many dollars out of that property as they possibly can. It could be all the Airbnb fools who bought properties they couldn't afford and are trying to get their money back, and they're asking more than the market will allow for, even though that's what they should be selling for. And in some places I've read that the housing market is actually doing quite well, and some houses are selling at market value. But then we also see stories of homeowners getting undervalued evaluations or appraisals for their homes because, it's a biracial couple or they're black, and they get a 40% reduction in the appraisal for their home, which is just sickening.
Because then I have to pose the question, if a person can have their home value reduced by 25% based on their race, what does value actually mean?
God damn, Chris.
That's just dirty.
You're right, man. It's kind of an arbitrarily assigned number at this point. I mean, and to that point, sort of tangential but on point, I once knew an Egyptian in the early 90s, and he anglicized his name. And in the earlier the phone segment that was recorded, I thought about that. It was like when he said, he's like, "Oh, I sound white when I speak." And the funny thing about the Egyptian that he knew, I'll just give his first name, Adam, which Adam in Arabic, but he anglicized it to just Adam, and he anglicized his last name completely. And the ironic part about him is he was Arab. He wasn't like sub-Saharan or like the sort of Egyptian that has a lot of southern Sudanese blood, which some brag and some don't. I don't want to get into cultural idiosyncrasies of that, but I thought he could basically pass as white, but he still felt obligated to anglicize and pass as white. And it made me so sad. Even back in the early 90s when I met him, I was like, why are we like this? Why is American culture like this? And why do people that jump into our nation for whatever reasons, I mean, I know cognitively why they do, but it's just so sad to see.
Well, I anglicized my first name because I don't expect people other than Chinese people or maybe Southeast Asian people to actually say my name correctly. And there's Chris and I have actually spoken about this kind of thing in person. There are, vocable shapes that our mouths make that unless you're raised in that culture, you might not actually be able to hear them anymore. You might not even know how to create those sounds with your vocal cavity and tongue. And so, I mean, I could say it, it's teen, but you're going to miss there's a subtle H sound in there. And it's just missing. I can't expect anyone to hear this over a 128 kilobits stream that's encoded as an MP3 that is designed to remove the top frequencies that humans aren't supposed to be able to hear and use subtle roll-off to make sure that those things don't, create artifacts. But it's there. I know Chris has heard it, because we've talked about this stuff, at length before. It's actually kind of scary to think that there is a whole range of names and language and sounds that we make that simply by genetic lottery or geographic lottery, cultural lottery, we're never going to be able to fully explore because of the complexity of our society and the distribution over the available landmass.
Yeah, I mean, my last name is spelled Eylath phonetically, and it's pronounced a lot with a hard T. And I've spent most of my life having my last name mispronounced by most people that I interact with unless they are familiar with the European pronunciation, because it's actually a European-based spelling that my grandfather adopted for it.
Do people say Ilath?
Oh, yeah.
But it's Eilat.
It's Eilat.
Eilat. Where is it from?
It's Israeli.
Ah, okay. Names are so interesting to me because my surname is Norman English. And a lot of folks have become so homogenized in their English. I can't speak for other languages. But even when I was in England, I was specifically in Nottingham. There was a woman at a hotel that could not pronounce my name. And I'd spent way too many days up in Glasgow. And I said out loud, my name is Shoulders. That is how it's pronounced. It is an English name. And my friends looked at me and they're like, damn. And I'm like, oh, I just said that out loud. I'm sorry. And the laziness that some people have for not just names, but for sort of cultural sensitivity, even within a branch of a genome or an island or whatever, is astounding to me. It's like you don't take the time, right? Like, wow.
I don't think people care to take the time when they think that they can get away with it.
Yeah, true. Sadly, very true.
I want to get back towards this sci-fi thing that we started a little bit ago. Maybe not so much with Dune. It occurred to me that when we first started talking about this stuff earlier this week, it occurred to me not just stuff like Dune, but Battlestar Galactica and Space 1999.
Oh my God, that's one of my favorites, Ken. God.
These were shows that, Battlestar Galactica was the template for Star Wars in a lot of ways, and we don't get to see that because it was turned into a mini series and actually just a television series, and then eventually a movie, and eventually the crew of the Battlestar Galactica ended up in Earth in the 80s somehow, and then they did a fabulous reboot that Sci-Fi Channel ran with, and I still feel like they did a good job. That miniseries holds up really well for me, even though I think that at times they got a little heavy-handed with some of the intentions and the focus on the religion, but I think that there was a really incredible era of television where the production quality, the technology behind it wasn't quite there, and they had really good stories. They had human stories, and they involved complex human situations, and they just happened to be set in space.
Yeah, well, I had grown up, to show my age, I had grown up in the mid to late 70s, and it was Saturday afternoon, Space 1999 was on, right? And that was a joint American and British production. And Battlestar Galactica, I can't remember when it was on network television in the 70s, but it was entirely American. And the conventions of that, and recently sort of
78 and 79.
Yeah, 78, 79, right? Like watching, and here's an interesting take as just a Midwestern white kid watching, and I had a really cool upbringing with my parents who encouraged my sci-fi stuff, and really got it, especially my mother. I grew up watching reruns of Star Trek and then watching in real time Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, and Space 1999, and how these shows tackled social commentary, everything from race to what defines culture and gender in a way that was subtle but not, like the right wing would be like, oh, it's social engineering. Like, no, you need to fuck off. It's education. Like, they're showing things from a different perspective. And the takeaways, I remember, for an example, watching Star Trek as a child and not understanding the full power of Nichelle Nichols being Uhura. But what I did understand was like, wow, there's this cool Kenyan woman, black woman. She speaks 9 or 10 languages. Like, she's not the captain of the ship, but she's like, wow, she's badass. And not because she's like a tough fighter, some bullshit machismo, but because she can do all these things. And then, flash forward when I'm in my late 30s, I got to meet Nichelle Nichols at Gen Con. And the weight of her and what she had done on so many levels almost made me cry. I was just like, like, she's such a great person because she was sitting there, even though she had autographed, she looked at my 2 children and was like, your children are so beautiful. And I'm like, wow, like, Nichelle, you are the most amazing, beautiful woman I've met in a long time. And then, like, seeing that, and sort of juxtaposing it on, like, the sort of starstruckness that I had for that show as a child, and then realizing the impact way across the board, of characters like that. And then you move into Battlestar Galactica. Wow. Like, they were pushing envelopes too. Now, I don't think as extreme as Star Trek was, but it was there.
Well, it's just like with Discovery Now, you have Michael Burnham as the main. I guess she's technically the protagonist.
She's definitely the protagonist. She's one of the few characters that actually gets to change. I mean, like, Saru changes by the end of the second series, or the second season, but Michael Burnham's character is continually going through this struggle to accept herself and to change and to become a better person, a better version of herself. And by the end of season 2, she's practically a different character. So I'm going to say she's absolutely a protagonist. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, I think part of it, though, is like, because of the way that the story is unfolding, you never know if you're watching a story where it's like an Odysseus tale, where the protagonist is really holding everything back. So it's like a weird, again, it's like, I kind of do feel like they are telling an Odysseus story, or an Odyssey rather. But in that's kind of where she's Odysseus and she's effectively the one that keeps the crew from the other shore. So it's like this weird, she's the protagonist and the antagonist.
Interesting. Yeah. I need to be fair, I need to watch more of the modern. The last time I had paid attention to Star Trek, and I had been a big fan for years, was Deep Space Nine.
Love Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, I mean, Cisco was just the coolest dude ever. I love Cisco. I loved Odo. Well, goddamn, there's so many layers of character development from everything from the Ferengi, the Cardassians. I can't say it quite right, but there's so many layers of what was going on in that show was astounding. Now, that was a bit later than the 70s and 80s, obviously, but
I would totally dig a show keeping up with the Kardashians.
Oh, that would. We need to make this happen. Who do we petition to get this to happen?
I find Discovery to be one of the most emotionally engaging series of the Star Trek universe.
Well, I feel like Discovery has like film pacing and the story arc. The story arc definitely exists over the series and within each individual season, but they pace each episode like a movie, so it is much more emotionally engaging each episode and over the course of the seasons and the story. So I think that's one of the ways they do succeed in engaging the audience emotionally, is like within each episode there's an open and closed story arc that then lead into a season narrative, which then leads into a larger story narrative, and those are all nested really well.
I feel like they didn't have as much time as they needed to really explore the relationship between Michael and Spock. But at the same time, the writers really did a good job just characterizing the emotional connection between the two, even though you have Spock coming from the place of logic, but not being at all shaken or ashamed to engage his emotions in communicating with his sister during times of pressure, or even just times of interpersonal interaction and exploration.
Yeah, I think the relationship between those two obviously is being retrofit into the narrative, so that's kind of where it's almost fitting in a way that they can't spend too much time on it, because if we've never found out about Michael Burnham before this series, the reason has to be good enough, and I think that they're doing a good job of making that reason good enough as to why we're just now finding out about Spock's half-sister in the series, or in the context of Star Trek lore. Like the way they're writing it, she's always been there. She just wasn't important enough to Spock to talk about.
Interesting.
Well, I don't want to give away the end of the second season, but there's a reason that.
But that's not. I don't think that's like spoiling anything.
Okay, so at the end of the second season, to resolve the primary story arc of Discovery, they used the Red Angel to travel forward in time to take it to a place where the AI of what is the nefarious Black Ops Federation group.
Section 32 or 31 or whatever.
Section 31. Is it Section 31? Yeah, Section 31. So Section 31 has been compromised by an advanced and malicious AI. And to get the Red Angel away from this entity now, they take it to a time where it doesn't exist in an effort to prevent it from just simply gaining access and undoing existence. And by the time everything is resolved, Spock stays behind, and they're going to do the spin-off into the Pike era of the Enterprise. So we're going to get a Pike Star Trek series, hopefully. Spock recommends to Starfleet that under penalty of like treason and probably execution, that no one is to speak of the events that occurred on Discovery or any of the ships or Section 31 relating to any of this, because no one can know. Because if the AI reemerges somehow and it finds out what happens, because some people in Starfleet can't keep their mouths shut, it could undo everyone's own safety. And so, of course, the Discovery is launched well into the future, like 1,000 years after Picard or something like that. And at least that's what I remember reading about it. So I guess that is kind of important, why it's never brought up, but it is kind of a hand of God moment where it's like, oh crap, how do we resolve this thing that's actually, we've already made up some excuse for why the technology was more advanced during Discovery, or the visualization of technology was more advanced during Discovery than it was during the original series. And it's tied into this AI. But
interesting.
Yeah.
And it was, it was really intelligent of them because they completely take her out of the timeline.
Yeah.
Man. So then she doesn't affect any timeline that we all know of Star Trek, and it continues normally. So there's like, the way they did it is actually really well done for them to be able to take her out of the timeline and then put her in the future.
Yeah.
Because then the whole reason you can't spoil it is because when they're like doing the trailers for season 3, they've already explained like everything you just said and more, because the Federation's falling apart and all this shit. So it's like all those things for people who haven't watched the show but are like, well, you're spoiling it for me now. Well, what would I do? It's like, well, there are things about the way this story is written that, because they always existed, the first 2 seasons are effectively a prequel anyway, and now the 3rd season, which everybody's just now getting to,
is the real story.
Yeah, it's like now we're getting into where the story can actually...
We're in the now sort of thing.
We're in the future now. Like, whereas before was in... I mean, obviously, all Star Trek stuff's in the past, but because of the way they set it up, all of the season 1 and season 2 was unchangeable anyway. But now we're actually finally getting into part of the story where the...
or it's actually Discovery.
Right. Well, the actual timelines change. It can change. Like, anything we watched in season 1 and 2 basically set even before we watched it, because it already pre-existed all of this stuff. But it's important to understand the characters, the way they're taking it. So it's like, it's not completely wasted. But that's where I always, whenever prequels get done, I'm always hesitant to watch them in the sense of they have to have something really important about the characters for them to be useful. Otherwise, you already know what's going to happen. It's like, nobody cares about what happened the week before the fucking Titanic sank. Let's watch the actual Titanic sink.
Yeah, right. I don't know what made me make the connection. Well, obviously before how you sort of write TV science fiction versus how you write science fiction novels. I grew up in the mid to late 70s watching the Tom Baker Doctor Who's on PBS. And no matter how good the doctors are, and they have been some fantastically good Doctor Who's, Tom Baker is my guy. But saying that, the brilliance of if you get a core of good writers, and this applies, the original Star Trek series had the most famous Star Trek original series episode. I think it was written by Harlan Ellison, and it was basically the one, I can't remember the name of the show, but they go through a corridor, and Bones falls in love with a woman that if she would have lived, she would have convinced the United States not to get involved in fighting the Nazis during World War II, and everything would have been fucked, right? Like, the sort of writing, like Douglas Adams wrote episodes of the Tom Baker Doctor Who, and the mechanisms that you have to be able to adapt and change to a TV media. Like, an actor can't play the doctor, or an actor can't play his companion. You have to retool. And, the idea that the doctor, and I don't know enough about Doctor Who, what they had originally envisioned when it was in the old black and white. Who was the original? Hartnell, I think, was the first Doctor, and the idea that, like, oh, when we have to write him out, oh, he regenerates, right? And seeing the sort of genius of good sci-fi writers in television to be able to adapt to things like that is astounding.
I think that's what makes them good writers. Is
Yeah,
the
right.
ability to adapt. I think that's why shows like Lost became so convoluted. Is that they had writers' strikes and they had to bring on different writers, and they weren't flexible enough, and they were trying to work with, a semi-established story while still being able to put their own stamp on it. And in the process, they turned it into this really convoluted. I love Lost. I love watching that show, but I also, I won't deny that it is extremely convoluted, and at times there are so many what the fuck moments that I have to pause and walk away for like a couple hours or a couple days even, because it's just like, okay, this is too much. I gotta get back to reality. I'll be back in a few. Unfortunately, it's been what, almost 20 years since that show was on the air. So
Been that long?
oh god, I think so. Maybe 15. It's
Yeah, well, and here's the thing too. People forget in the early 80s,
2004 to 2010. So
I was an elementary school kid, was huge Buck Rogers fan. And I didn't understand it then. But the non sequitur sort of end of season 1, starting into season 2, I think it was 81, 82, there was a writer's strike then. And it started out like, okay, they've sort of taken a new direction, but then they just sort of got lost because showrunners and writers had left, and the original vision, if you will, even though that Buck Rogers was basically a reboot of a reboot, because it's an old 50s, 60s serial thing, but they even had Buster Crabbe do a cameo in one of the first season episodes, and they made a joke. Buster Crabbe was talking to the actor that played Buck Rogers. Oh, maybe we would have met in a different time, in a different world, or something like that. And I'm like, that's brilliant. But the direction it took in season 2 was in direct relationship to a writer's strike that took place in that era.
Well, and then, yeah, I think the writers don't get enough credit in general, just because we only see the actors, but the writers, like between season 4 and season 6 of Star Trek: The Next Generation, the writing went so far downhill. It's really bad, and that's kind of where you can start to see when the writers check out of a series and they start doing the same shit over and over, start throwing in we're gonna shrink the adults into kids types episodes and shit like that, where it's so much on the writers to bring life into a series and not just let it get stale. Like, the actors do a lot, but the writers are really the ones breathing the life into it. It's really crazy.
yeah, no, they're 3 seasons, like middle 3 seasons of TNG that I just skip over when I pull my marathon, and I start Stargate SG-1 with season 1, but then after the end of the first season, I jump straight to the 5th season, and
that's smart.
and
Well, and it's like you flash forward to the, I think it was the late 90s or early was it late 90s, early 2000s, of Farscape.
Farscape was a lot of fun, but it was it's a kind of a dark comedy.
Yeah,
And
but they sort of, well, I don't know if they say they ended it where they wanted to end it, but at least they had the luxury when the series ended, sort of abruptly, that they were able to do the TV film, The Peacekeeper Wars, to sort of wrap it all up.
there's actually a really good nod to Farscape in I think it's like season 10 of Stargate SG-1, or maybe it's season 9. I'm pretty sure it's season 10. And they have this. There's this reoccurring character who's been trying to get a TV show off the air, and he gets he somehow gets the military, and specifically the SG teams or SG command, to act as consultants. And at one point, there is this moment where they kind of put on the Farscape makeup and costumes and do this fake interpretation of it. And at this point, the leader of SG-1 is the same actor as the guy from Farscape, except in this reinterpretation, he plays like a cyborg or something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there are actually a few crossovers with Stargate. I think there was an episode where it was directed by the CSI Vegas production team. Stargate's actually a really good show. I always wish that they'd have brought it back with a better story than SGU.
And
SGU was just like, really, guys? Let's put the most incompetent people we possibly can on a team that's going to be performing a survey on an alien world and potentially opening up, the ninth cartouche to, we don't even know where the fuck it is, but it's going to destroy an entire planet to get to it. That's just too much. That's like jumping all the sharks with another shark.
Jumping the shark and everybody dies, right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem, man. I don't know if it's just me or if other folks see this, but like the sort of challenging idea of science fiction, right? Like real, to me, science fiction pushes you into uncomfortable zones. And I don't mean like the idea that you're uncomfortable of concepts that are evil, but stuff that challenges your cultural norms, right? Like, and modern science fiction seems more obsessed with explosions and slick imagery, which there's nothing wrong with slick imagery. I love that too. But these whole ideas that sit and make you like, well, what the fuck, right? Like,
yeah, the story's not supposed to suffer. We're not supposed to lose
that?
the story for the sake of some explosions or CGI, and I think that's really what you're getting at, and that's what we get a lot of. It just because it's set in the future or on a spaceship or there are aliens doesn't make it science fiction if it's just CGI and a terrible story. That just means that's just a bunch of cosplay at that point.
Yeah, there was a movie that was done. Oh, was it the 90s? It was called Hardware. And,
I remember that movie.
Yeah, and when you originally watch it, you're like, oh, it's just about a robot going psychotic or an AI going psychotic. But there's so many layers of what's going on in that movie. And it's like, wow, this is a really cool science fiction story. And the fact that Lemmy from Motorhead was on a boat as a taxi driver and he's playing Ace of Spades on his boat is hilarious. But there's so much going on. It's like those things that are hidden. Like when I had read Starship Troopers not long after I had seen the film. And wow, I think the original book was written in the late 50s, and it's more slow paced than the film.
Well, the film does a terrible job of interpreting the book. It glorifies fascism and nationalism and militarism, and the actual the literature was a cautionary tale against those things.
Exactly my point. It's like, did you not read Heinlein's book? I mean, yes, you sort of did, but you didn't really. Like, what?
One of my favorite examples of sort of eternally contemporary sci-fi that showed up on TV was Lex. And talk about uncomfortable situations. I mean, the main characters are like a mechanic who becomes an unwitting captain of an organic spaceship that's the most powerful weapon in two universes, a love slave, an undead former assassin, and a robot head that falls in love with just about anything. And in the first season, this is a synopsis of the first season. So the three characters accidentally steal the weapon, and then they flee the main planet of this League of 20,000 planets because they want to find a new home. And then the assassin needs special blood to live outside of his cryo chamber. So in looking for that blood, they return back to that home to discover that a huge insect is controlling the governing body of the League of Planets and wants to eat all human inhabitants of the 20,000 planets. And then that insect is going to turn into what's called a Giga Shadow. And the Giga Shadow produces the blood that the assassin needs to survive. And then the love slave helps the assassin get all of the blood he needs to survive. And then the assassin puts a lizard inside the brain of the giant insect and destroys it.
Lex was definitely innovative. I didn't get to see a lot of it when it came out, but what I did get to see, I was like you said, Daniel, it was like, wow, this is way ahead of the curve. It is so pushing in a good way. Like, this is sci-fi, man. It's in the right ways.
Yeah, I remember an episode where the characters were turned into chess pieces that ended up getting executed every time a piece was captured. So like there were multiple copies of them, and then every time one of the pieces that they represented got captured, like they died, but somehow they ended up surviving. It's kind of a curious scenario.
That's like that Harry Potter thing, right?
Yeah, right. Like they're all playing chess. This makes me think of, like, I remember on social media, all these, well, for lack of a better word, assholes were complaining about Liette Kynes being played by a black woman. And I'm like, what is your fucking problem, man? Like, it's sort of the musical equivalent to me of people like, well, why are these bands political? I'm like, what, you didn't really listen to The Clash or Rage Against the Machine back in the day? What, you missed the fucking lyrics? and to see these assholes that never read Dune, or to be so bold to say, are they even fucking literate, are going on about, like, well, the character's supposed to be what? Where in the book does technically Dune that Liette Kynes is, well, he is a man in the book, but to say that he's white, but like, if you take license in a good way, it works, man. Like,
I'm going to say that it's because those people have not read the book and they've only seen the movie. And I recently rewatched the David Lynch movie, and there are zero people of color.
yeah,
Like absolutely zero. They go from desert tanned white people to space pale guild members who are seeping fluids from, cracks in their bodies because they ingest so much of the drug spice that they're basically, intergalactic crackheads.
well, and in the novels, and I had read all of them. I had even read some of Frank Herbert's son's novels, and it's a thing throughout the novels. It's called the Zen Sunni tradition. And Herbert was brilliant. He fused this sort of Islamic idea mixed with Zen Buddhism. And the Fremen are sort of proto-space Arabs. There's no way around that. That's what they are.
Yeah.
You know, and like, even if you go from the idea of evolution and culture and ethnicity, sorry, man. Yeah, the Fremen might have some white folks in them, but they're not going to be predominantly white.
Well, I don't think
That's
that.
just the way.
I don't think that's the way that the human skin works. I think if a society or a culture lives in an area that has meets the threshold of exposure to ultraviolet radiation, they will start to develop concentrations of melanin higher concentrations of melanin to protect their skin. They will develop the ability to process vitamin D from sunlight more efficiently or extra efficiently or however way efficiently you want to put it. I don't think that these, was it a Bill Nye meme or a Neil deGrasse Tyson meme where it's like race is just a construct. We know now that it's all about your geographic location and exposure to various amounts of sunlight that determine your hair, skin, and eye color. Well, to some degree, some people have blonde hair and blue eyes, and I think that was originally a mutation. But
Yeah, well, it's a recessive gene.
Yeah.
You know, and I hate to break it to my fellow white people, but we came from black. It's not the other way around. We weren't always around. Sorry. And the other science fiction thing, being a big Warhammer 40,000 fan, seeing the fascination that some of the weird right-wingers in that gaming community have latched onto Trump and this sort of bullshit, and they complain. And there's a YouTuber, what's his name? Arch Warhammer. And for a while, I thought he was British because he exaggerated his accent, but he's actually Norwegian, who he adopts an English accent. And he's so just vile, man. He's just like, oh, I hate social justice warriors. I hate this. I hate representation in the Warhammer. I was like, have you not read the sort of the books, the lore of where this world comes from? Because it's astounding to me that people can take away, and I've read countless of the novels related to the world, and it's like everything from like gay protagonists to gay antagonists to entire like groups of protagonists that would, for lack of a better nomenclature, you would consider a Black culture or an Asian culture, because that's hard to do in sci-fi. Like, they're 40,000 years into the future, right? Like, but all of these cultures are represented, and they're represented as both villains and heroes. But yet there's this element in the community that's like, oh, I don't want to have this. And I'm like, you're insane. Like, I don't know how any other way around that sort of person.
We've talked about why literature seems to be concentrated with one ethnic group or ethnicity, and how I really think it's just a reflection of a lack of creativity on the writer's side. They don't know how to write for a different culture because they don't know how to envision a new culture. They only know how to project what they think the future is for their own culture. And
well, honestly, I want them writing my culture anyway. To be honest,
I'm sorry.
I don't want them writing my culture anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that writers should be taking license or taking liberties to project some culture that they don't actually understand, because they're going to screw it up.
Yeah, because then it's like as if there aren't people within the culture who are also writers, and
Yeah.
that's why they present this narrative as if that's the case. So then they can come in and say, well, this is why we write these terrible black characters, because there's no black writers writing black characters. Like, yeah, there are. You just don't put them.
You're not paying attention.
Yeah, because that's just like, you know, Misha Green is writing for Lovecraft Country, whereas,
which is awesome, by the way. Holy crap! That show's really good. Sorry, I didn't mean.
No, I was gonna say a lot of people think J.J. Abrams is actually writing the show, and he's not the one writing the actual show.
He's just producing it.
Yeah, he's just producing. Him and Jordan Peele.
Yeah.
And I think Jordan Peele is an amazing talent on so many levels.
Wait, was he tried to do like, what was it, Outer Limits or Twilight Zone?
Ooh, I don't know which one.
Oh,
It was Twilight Zone.
yeah, it was Twilight Zone. So I really enjoyed watching the original Twilight Zone when I was a kid. I watched it with my dad and I watched it with my grandpa. And then I tried to rewatch it again in anticipation of the rebooted or reimagined Twilight Zone, and it was just so hard to watch. It's like some of the most racist shit imaginable. It was hard.
Stuff does not age well.
Yeah,
it's terrible.
But the Jordan Peele Twilight Zone, that was actually really cool. There were times when I thought it's like, oh, they're just kind of trying. They're not even trying that hard. But by the end of it, you see a different experience with that whole mythology, that whole losing control mythology, and you see that the story is much broader than, it's not just black and white anymore. It's in color, and I mean literally, it's in color. It's not a black and white TV show.
Yeah. Were you ever able to watch his sort of next project called the Night Gallery?
No.
That he had done. I had watched it as a kid, and they even did a Night Gallery movie, like in that era. And the only thing that stuck out of the Night Gallery to me was there was a brilliant episode.
Wow, they did 43 episodes.
Yeah, of this guy, and I think it might have been in the movie. I don't know if it was in the series. This guy came to a painting in the museum of, it was some idyllic, like pastoral field or whatever, and he keeps praying, "Oh dear God, I've done horrible things. I want to be transported to this place when I die." And he finally ends up at the end of the episode. He's in that part of the museum, but it's dark. You don't see the painting. And he prays to be in that painting. And it comes out over the course of the episode. I believe he was a Nazi concentration camp guard who did some really awful things. And when the cops finally come to get him, or the authorities, I don't remember. I was young when I saw this. And they rush up, and he's praying, and they come up there, and he's gone. And they flash to the painting, and it's something like a crucifixion scene. And he's in the painting, and he's like one of the people behind, like Jesus on a cross or something. And I'm like, wow. That was so powerful to me as a child to see that episode. I was like, how did they get away with doing this back then?
Yeah, I often wonder, like, every so often I'll go and try and find some science fiction series or movie that I haven't seen before, something really old, and you end up in a rabbit hole of options because the internet just has untold options, and there's so much crap, like absolute crap. Like, and I'm not talking about like a Roger Corman B movie where it's like, oh, this is gonna be fun because those are just silly, intentionally.
Oh, well, yeah, you can make fun of those, right?
Well, those are designed to make fun of them. They're like deprecating comedies in a sense, and even no matter how serious they are, they're funny. But there were so many bad science fiction stories out there that are serious, like really serious, and you can tell. And this is the most painful part: the actors are, you can tell they're really putting like as much as they can into it. They're trying to show that they've got like the chops, that they can somehow carry, the story. But I don't care how good an actor somebody is. If you got a bad story, a good actor's not going to make it float.
That's true. I always wondered, I don't know why that made me think that it was only probably about 10 years ago that I learned that Lucas had approached, of all people, Toshiro Mifune to be Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I always wondered how different Star Wars and that character would have been had the amazing badass Mifune, who was a great actor and a tremendous talent, would have got a hold of that character. Not that Guinness was not a great talent, but he was a very different actor and a very different character in real life. How would Obi-Wan would have been shaped by Mifune?
I don't think it would have been the same movie.
Exactly.
Like at all. I don't think that. I don't think that we can actually. How do I say it? I think we're far enough away from Star Wars, from the original trilogy, that any reimagining of it that we engage in is essentially going to create a reboot. It's not even. It can't even be the same movie at this point.
That's true.
We might as well have had. We might as well have had Tom Selleck be Han Solo.
Oh dear God.
Well, he was supposed to be the original Indiana Jones.
Yep, I had read that. Yeah.
So it's not a. I feel like that's not too far of a stretch for Tom Selleck to have been Han Solo. There are a bunch of examples of movies that didn't get made with the cast that was originally intended. Like Ruby Rhod was supposed to be Prince, but it just didn't work out with Prince's touring schedule.
Wow, Chris
Tucker got really lucky, and they were like, "Well, this was originally written for Prince." He's like, "I love Prince," and then he does his Ruby Rhod thing, and
Ruby Rhod.
He's the best character.
It's him. Chris Tucker is Ruby Rhod. You can't.
I mean, Chris Tucker's performance in Fifth Element steals the show for me. Like, I watched Fifth Element the other night, and I really didn't give a damn about the movie, like any of it. It was all just like, I like this part, but as soon as Ruby Rhod comes on the screen, I'm like glued to it at that point, and I don't really care about anything but the Ruby Rhod story. Like his commentary of the fight to take back the Floston Paradise cruise ship. I mean, at the end of it, he's like, he takes off his headset. He's like, that was the best show I've ever performed, or something. Best performance of my life, or best show I've ever did, I think is actually what he says. And
it's always sort of the luck of the universe, if you will. When somebody changes something or gets recast, I always love the idea that Harrison Ford had the strength of character to argue with Lucas in the scene where
he was a set builder. He was a carpenter on for Star Wars.
Yeah, well, he had walked by and they're like, here, read this role, basically, is how he got the role. But when he argued with Lucas in The Empire Strikes Back, Han Solo wouldn't say that. And then he's like, when Leia says the iconic line, "I love you, I know," it stuck. You couldn't imagine any other line, right? Like,
Well, there are a lot of lines that seem to get misremembered. Like Luke, I am your father, which isn't in the movie at all. He doesn't say Luke. He's like, no, I am your father. But that's the whole Mandela effect.
mm,
Collective memory sucks, and even more so now that people are questioning their own memory, because I remember seeing the version of Star Wars where Han shoots first, but there's an entire generation of people who didn't see it until the re-release where Greedo shoots first. But we all know the truth.
yeah.
Han wouldn't have waited for Greedo.
Hell no, man. Like, there's no way. Like, I mean, that's the thing. Like,
Han was a shrewd dude. He waited. They explain it very clearly in the movie Solo. Like, he waited for that one, for his business partner, and at the end he doesn't wait. He shoots first. They clear it up. He shoots first. Han does not wait for anybody. He knows when someone's going to try and fucking kill him. He's really good at staying alive. The only reason that his kid kills him is because he's trying to bring his son home. And of course, he's already been lost to the dark side at that point. So, man, Solo is my favorite of the Star Wars stories at this point, because it shows us a version of Lando that is actually quite capable, not a freaking administrator, and it shows us how just why that ship is so important.
well, and
it doesn't have any Skywalkers. Oh, that's the best part. It has 0 Skywalkers.
back in the late 70s, man. Like, the idea of a starstruck Midwestern white kid, watching, the television box, right? And seeing, black actors playing positive black roles. Boomer, Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, right? Like, oh, she speaks 9 languages. She's a cryptologist. Boomer's this incredible pilot. Like, they weren't necessarily like the in command roles, but as a kid, you're like, wow, like, like these things formulate in your brain, like, and as you grow older, and the absence, the sort of weird idea that, like, I saw this stuff as a kid, and when I saw Star Wars, there was outside of Lando, kind of like, wait, are there any Arab actors? Are there any black actors?
I'm pretty sure that all of the other ethnic groups of humanity were represented by aliens, which is why the Empire is so xenophobic. I think that's a big component. Like with Star Trek, they tried to have Sulu with Takai be an out homosexual man, but in the end, they weren't able to pull it off because the studio pushed back. And then finally, with the Kelvin timeline, they're able to show us Sulu as an openly gay man with a family and a child. And I'm pretty sure that without coming out and saying it, we all knew Sulu wasn't into the ladies.
Yeah, well,
I mean, I think it was always really obvious.
The beauty of Star Trek, even though you kind of can it in its time, the kiss between Uhura and Kirk fucking angered the censors.
Well, Shatner had to say that it didn't happen, and then Nichelle Nichols says, like, "Oh, it absolutely happened." I mean, it's like only one of them had to worry about saving their career. The other one was like, "Hey, we did this. Let's be proud of it."
Well, and to bleed into other shows, I used to watch Laugh-In with my mother. And there was one of it was James Garner, of course, famous actor back in the up until the 80s, right? But he was big in the 60s to the 70s and to the early 80s. He was on an episode, and this must have been something back in like 69 when the show was going. One of the sort of dancers and comedians in the show was black. And he leaned in to kiss her. And they both looked at the camera. If I remember correctly, I would love to kiss you, but the censors wouldn't allow it. And this was a show that got in trouble with television censors in the 60s. And I'm like, wow, the sort of courage, even though we don't see it as courage now, that they were given the fucking middle finger to the establishment about their bullshit and pushing.
Yeah, and it's just, I think that's a prime example of how media is used to overcome societal prejudices, but at the same time, how even 60 years later, that type of action is still, it's still causing problems in that, it's a controversial act even this far later. And in that it's not that the act itself is causing problems now, it's that the notion of William Shatner at some point being a person who was pushing for equality and what he's become today is like, it's insane what the freedom fighters of yesterday, all you had to do to be a freedom fighter was like the minimal shit of recognizing black people as like humans, and now that same person is basically a despicable piece of shit for not. Oh
my God, his presence on Twitter is, to say it's problematic is a fucking understatement, right? Like, I'm like, wow, Chad. Like,
I try not to read his stuff too much, not to lose too much respect for him, but ever so often he would start trending because of something he said, and it's just like, man, this dude, why doesn't he just not say anything? Don't say away. And it's like, for someone who had such a great legacy, fuck, he destroyed that shit on Twitter, man.
Yeah.
He had such a great legacy that he just ground in the shitter because he couldn't stop talking about autistic people. Couldn't help it. Couldn't help himself.
Well, it's sad that some people eventually reveal their sort of inner true character. Like you think, and I've lost heroes or people that I've thought were cool, right? And I'm like, wow, I can't listen to your music. I can't read your literature. I'm done.
Yeah, back to what Chris was saying about the quote unquote freedom fighters or rebels or the socially conscious advocates of previous generations. A lot of what ended up happening was people just falling into hedonistic tendencies that came along with the cultural upheaval and not really taking it beyond that, or falling into patterns of exploitation and then subsequently getting folded back into the establishment, even if they were, and essentially becoming commercialized symbols of that rebellious generation that could be then used to monetize those ideas and make people feel like they're affecting change when in fact they're not. And the people who could have affected change are the ones who had access to vast inherited wealth and influence, and perhaps could have tried to shift directions by trying to influence their own families or make dramatic decisions with their own assets, or even the parents of those people, had they made decisions based off of the cultural changes that their offspring were more tuned into, had they listened, then I don't think we would have seen as much of a return of the quote unquote hippie generation to the office job arena, because something would have actually changed. I mean, we've said on the show before that the civil rights movement was the point in American history when the discussion actually started. And it was the point where people were willing to sit down in the same room with each other and have those challenging dialogues and conversations, and not even walk out of the room convinced of what the other, having to say was actually valid or true. And we all really need to look no further than the current socioeconomic climate to see that.
It's wow, Daniel, like as an Xer and early on being into punk rock as early as 12 or 13 years old, seeing this sort of punk rock ethos turning into that sort of hippie thing. We're like, oh, we become the establishment. And also on that sort of note, seeing things from the late 70s, early 80s that are still would be considered subversive, I guess, misinterpreted. And Chris and I have talked about like gothic or punk bands who have tackled racial or homophobic things in their music and in their lyrics that people in the 2000s would be like, oh, that's this. And I'm like, that's the exact opposite message that they were both intending and that they actually sent. But, to be fair, though, like, it's also the phenomenon of, like, I'm seeing, like, people like, why are you making this band political? And I'm like, the Clash have always been political. They've always been about this, or Rage Against the Machine have always been about this. Did you not listen to these lyrics? Did you not listen to Lou Reed? Like, Lou Reed to the uninformed sounds totally crazy, but when you know where he is and what he's trying to say, it's pretty clear.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you think about musicians, the popular musicians, the ones trying to get those messages out there. But I can't help but think about how they too are representatives of a massive, monolithic, money-focused capitalistic industry. And if they share those messages and they resonate with the youth, then it's more likely to drive up record sales. So there's not necessarily a motivation to actually drive change from within that industry once you're in it. Because once you're in it, you don't want to mess with the money.
You know, Dennis, you reminded me of something when you said that hippies and punk rockers all basically are confronted with this idea that when they grow up, they essentially become the man. That's actually some really, really subversive cultural warfare, because it plants the seed that, like, oh, when I grow up, I might end up becoming the man. I don't want to be the man. Fuck the man. Raise the fist, give him the finger, and so it subconsciously it redirects people to this place where they intentionally don't become the man, when the reality is, in America, you're either the man or you work for the man. So if you want to thrive and fully embrace American capitalism and American neoliberalism, then you kind of have to grow up to become the man. That's like really fucking insidious. Screw the man.
Damn it, Tia. Fuck.
I think that gets back to the notion of most people not actually being capitalists, just living in a capitalist society and actually being the capital in most cases. Because if you're not the man, then you're working for the man in this construct. And if that's the case, you are the human capital.
Yes, we've been publicly referred to by government officials as human capital. So there's no secret about that there.
Yeah, it's pretty out there in the open where the government sits, right?
Yeah, even down to when there were power outages, all the news stories were referring to people as customers instead of actual people.
Numbers.
Yeah.
Right, because the customers were without the power, not the people who couldn't afford to pay their bills, who weren't customers anymore and didn't have power anyway. So we don't care about them, right? Is that the message we're supposed to be getting?
I think that's the message.
That seems the implication, yeah.
Welcome to end stage capitalism. Fuck.
Well, because then it's, I think this system always makes it seem as if there's nothing beyond it, but...
Well, that's not true. There's socialism, there's neo-feudalism and fascism, there is anarchism, there is revolution. There are plenty of things that come after neoliberalism and capitalism.
Sadly, America is neck deep in orange fascism. Fucking hell, man. Oh.
What America is deep in is the gross delusion that everybody can become a multi-billionaire, superhero, plutocratic,
oligarch,
industrialist, self-made noble that can date a supermodel that they rescued from some fascist country.
And prevented her from becoming an assassin.
But little do they know she really is an assassin, but she's reformed, and she's also the bodyguard. Like that's what Americans are expecting from their lives at this point.
Oh my God. I was just discussing this with my wife the other day, that a lot of Americans have this insane attitude that they're just a millionaire waiting to happen. I'm poor by accident. You are not fucking poor by goddamn accident.
They are temporarily humiliated millionaires who are working their way.
Poor person, right? Like, fuck off with that dumb shit.
And if they don't believe in classes, then they don't understand that some people becoming millionaires is within their reach. It just doesn't happen within a week. Like they have to be able to basically conform and keep a job with a specific level of income and make very specific financial decisions for 30 years straight, and not have any interruptions, and not ever get sick or injured or amass a large amount of debt or medical debt or have a kid. And then maybe you can make $1 million or like $2 million by the time you're like, depending on when you start and how fortunate you are, like by the time you're, 60, whatever. But in real life, it doesn't happen like that. You either have to be born rich or born into a family that's got the capital. You've got to be able to be the type of person that had the opportunity to just exploit a whole bunch of people, or you were able to capitalize on a bunch of other people's money. It's basically how it goes, and everybody thinks that they can somehow do it. Everybody thinks that they can go from wherever it is that they are. A majority of these people think that they can go from wherever it is that they are in their lives, from wherever they were born. It doesn't matter. Pop culture reinforces the idea. Media reinforces the idea. It's like they're blind to job statistics and what they mean. There's no financial literacy because there's such little financial literacy. People actually have these misconceptions because they don't actually understand how money really works.
Yeah, what financial literacy that I don't know if we technically have, but that's pushed. I love how people who make $1 million a year will tell people that make $50,000 a year how they should manage their money. Like they even know how people like that live.
Our congressional representatives make over $600 an hour just sitting around. Like when they take their recesses, they're still being paid because they're given a salary. So they're making $600+ an hour to go home.
Yeah.
$600 an hour. And they're telling people who make, $12 an hour that they just need to live within their means. Like,
well, and that couple, I just had this thought, man, that like, I'd read this great article, I can't remember where it was from, but this whole QAnon phenomenon that couples in with this sort of super capitalism and where the inroad where we are. And for a while I thought, man, this kind of sounds familiar. Why is this conspiracy theory resonating in my brain as a history person?
Because it's from the 1900s.
Well, I read an article that, and it was right in front of me, that it connects, it's a reinterpreted anti-Semitic blood libel, crazy train bullshit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, holy fuck, this article makes it all make sense. Not that they make sense, but why they've gotten to that point sadly makes sense.
Well, I find that whenever I run into the QAnon crap, it's always somebody that just wants some new way to complain about George Soros, but they still lack the fundamental ability to explain how a commodities exchange works.
Well, and that's the problem even with complaining about George Soros, is it's so embedded in an anti-Semitism, man.
Yeah.
And it's like, Jesus, stop it, guys. Like, you just want to smack these fuckers up the side of the head with a 2x4, and it's like, you want to look at them. I'm like, fascism is tapped into pre-existing hatreds. Like they just don't pop out of a vacuum. They're tapped into, man. And I'm like, and even when you go into that, I was like, you think the Third Reich got their ideas from nowhere? No, they tapped into a really evil vein of anti-Semitism in Europe.
They got more from America than they did from Europe, I think.
And that's where I'm going to. They tapped into an American vein of hatred where they're like, oh, slavery, Jim Crow, oh, segregation, oh, eugenics. They took that shit from America, but we never want to admit that.
Well, what's funny is they took economic theories and social theories from America right before the Great Depression. like like all of these things that they took from America and revamped and rewrote in German, which incidentally did manage to redirect the development of the German economy. And there are a lot of people who argue that those policies helped to make Germany strong again. But I'm going to say that it was at the cost of people and human lives, and those lives were treated as numbers and statistics. And so we can't really say that that stuff was successful. But it amuses me that they decided to take, a page out of the playbook, the American playbook, that essentially led to the destruction of the American economy and American culture. They took advice from people who intentionally undermined every civil rights development that happened between the signing or the Emancipation Proclamation and the Great Depression. Like all of that work was undone by people that were called progressives, by Woodrow Wilson and his ilk. There's a really fucked up portion of our history that no one wants to talk about. There's a reason they don't talk about Woodrow Wilson and the progressives in high school history, because those were the guys that fucked everyone, that deregulated everything. They're the ones who essentially set everything up for failure. And they made a lot of money. They all made a lot of money. The robber barons, they made a fuck ton of money. Those industrial lords of the emergent neo-feudal society that was going to happen, but it didn't, because the economy collapsed, because lo and behold, an industrial economy can't actually support neo-feudalism the way that it was working.
In a way, it doesn't surprise me, because on one hand we talk about Carnegie, right? Like, oh, he built libraries, he did all this stuff. He had, I believe it was the Pinkerton security group, shoot his own fucking workers, right? Like, I don't care how philanthropic he supposedly was. He was a fucking rat bastard.
Yeah, it was during the Homestead strike.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892. It lasted 7 days, or 6 days, 7 days, and there was a battle between the strikers and the Pinkertons.
Oh, what was it? Was it the Pinkertons? I couldn't remember for sure.
Yeah, they were Pinkerton agents. It was at Carnegie Steel.
Yeah, he was a fucker, man. Like, people will deify him now. Well, as like, a modern American industrialist, an immigrant story. And I'm like, I don't give a fuck if he's Scottish. And you know how I feel about my Scottish ancestry. I'd push the fucker off a cliff.
I'm not saying that, helping to establish a national public library system absolves him from his complicity with just atrocities towards American workers. But yeah, philanthropy doesn't get to wipe a slate clean. I don't think Chris has mentioned this before, that philanthropy and the act of giving back, it's basically like when somebody squeezes the blood out of a society and then it says, oh, well, here, you can have some of it back. Or basically it's like, I'm going to steal all this stuff, but I'll let you have a little bit of it when I'm done. It's actually like it's almost like a basis for trickle-down economics. It's like,
also tax advantaged.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, like I once heard a minister who is really cool had the analogy: if I steal $100,000 from you and only give back 60,000 and act like I should be praised, that's insane. Like, and that's where the Carnegies of the world are. I stole from whoever, praise me, I gave some of it back.
So we're about to wrap up, but I've got one quick question. Hot Pocket, is it an oversized Totino's pizza roll, or is it one of those square pizzas from elementary school, folded in half and then sealed with like a George Foreman sandwich press?
Exceptional Radio.
Exceptional Randos show is produced live in Sunroom Studios Base Capsule and in partnership with KLST 103.5, RadioCallisti.org. Remember to catch our Exceptional Randos live stream on YouTube every Sunday between 2 and 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you have a story, idea, or question that you would like to share, we want to hear from you. Thanks for listening.
Well, that was random. Exceptional Radio.